Synanon was an organization that many would say was a cult, and I feel like there are a lot of docu-series, especially now, even on HBO with the Cult of Mother God. There's definitely a rise in this topic and interest in it. So I wondered, the question sort of twofold: what do you attribute this fascination to, and how did you go? How do you make a series stand out from others that are approaching a similar topic?
Yeah. Well, why don't I start, and then you can answer the first question with our attraction to this story. And part of what drew us to this story was the fact that it wasn't an obvious cult. And, some people consider it a cult, some people don't. And the fact that it has its roots starting as this drug treatment program in Santa Monica in 1958. It was the first residential drug treatment program in the United States. It was enormously innovative and forward-thinking. There were, interracial marriages. It was very diverse, and it really had an interesting vision that had an extraordinary impact on people's lives. So many of the people who we talked to who went through Synanon, even who experienced some of the darker times at Synanon, really said over and over again, I wouldn't be alive today if it wasn't for Synanon, right? So it was a place that saved people's lives. And so to us, it's much more complex and nuanced than maybe a traditional cult series, because it had so many positive aspects to it.
Yeah, and I guess I would say sort of as part of that, and the question as to why is there this fascination in this moment with, cults or communities like this is, that, well, probably a couple of things. One is if you look across the sort of contemporary landscape, there is this engagement with the cult of personality and people attaching themselves to charismatic leadership and forming communities around that leadership. And one of, we think the lessons of the Synanon Fix and what you experience across the series is that when you sort of, pin your community to one individual, where that individual goes, the community follows. And, Chuck Dieterich was the founder of Synanon, and he was the leader of Synanon for, 3 decades. And he was a brilliant, complicated guy who in a lot of ways sort of lost his moral compass or began to drift from the initial values and principles that were important to him and to Synanon, and the community followed. And so I think that people today are seeing within themselves and within, America, these different communities forming around that. And it's sort of a part of, today's phenomenon, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, to what you're saying about Chuck kind of losing his moral compass, it's like sobriety wasn't even like the mission anymore at some point, right?
Well, I think Synanon started as we said, this drug treatment program, and it's the pillars that it was founded on was no drugs and alcohol and no violence. And by the end, they had bought more firearms than anybody in the history of California, and there was an open bar in the facility, right? So tracking through individual stories how it went from this really idealistic vision and place to something that was, at the very other end of the spectrum, and understanding how they made sense of that transitions and the various moments along the way, I think gives you a deep insight not only to these facilities or places that might feel cult-like, but also to the human experience and, how we can get swayed. I think one of the driving forces that we've come to understand that really attracted people to Synanon, both, eventually non-drug users as well as the drug users, was loneliness and this sense of community and being together with these different people from, very varied backgrounds. It was a very enriching experience. So it's interesting because despite so much darkness and hardship that happened at Synanon, almost everybody we talked to who went through there says that they'd do it again, and that they don't regret it, and for many of them, they feel like it really saved their lives.
I read some trivia that there were some very famous 70s filmmakers that were using Synanon members as extras. I wondered how you would characterize the rest of Los Angeles' relationship to Synanon at the time. How did the rest of the community view the organization?
Well, Synanon, almost right out of the gates was sort of this darling of the political and, entertainment elite. And so you had, senators and presidents, kind of looking at it. It was in Santa Monica. It was right there at the ocean, and they, referred to it as the miracle on the beach. And it was, as Rory had said, really forward and progressive and effective. And you have, Lucille Ball and Jane Fonda and
Leonard
Nimoy and Lee Marvin and,
and Senator Dodd of Connecticut, senators as well.
Yeah, and they're coming down and they're hanging out at Synanon. Steve Allen, and they're talking about it on their shows. And you have also staying at Synanon, a lot of the early addicts were well-known musicians. I mean, in fact, we first kind of, 10 years ago or so, started to learn about Synanon through the memoir of Art Pepper, who was a very famous jazz saxophonist. And, Joe Pass and, different, kind of, I guess, hip and dynamic entertainment folks were staying at Synanon and getting treated there. So that helped too.
Yeah.
Obviously, you two longtime collaborators and, no strangers to complicated, challenging subject matter. With something like this, what was the process of acquiring your subjects, getting them to trust you? Were there people that were resistant? I mean, it kind of seems like everyone's pretty down to talk about it. So
yeah, it was a challenge, actually. I mean, I think that this was a story that kind of people knew about a little bit, and different people had approached telling the story of Synanon over the years. But I think the folks who went there weren't open to necessarily sharing everything that had happened there. But, in talking to some of the subjects, many of them are here at Sundance, which is great. They really felt like this was the time and we were the team to tell this story, I think, which, is a great honor for us to do that, I think. So it took some convincing, for sure, to help people understand, because there's a very sensationalist story that you can tell about Synanon, right? And there's a way you could tell it that would really capitalize on that. And so it took some people a while to really feel like we were in it for the long haul, and that we wanted to get to the depths of Synanon and really try to capture what it was like from their perspective. Another challenge we faced with the film was the archive, which was massive, and there was kind of a long negotiation with the trustees at Synanon, because they documented a lot of what happened at Synanon, and there was resistance to sharing that archive. We felt like we could make the series without that archive, ultimately, and so we moved forward while still building those relationships. And ultimately, actually, towards the end of the project, technically it was about 3 weeks before we were supposed to lock initially, they said they would give us the archive. And so that was, thousands of photographs, of film elements, video elements that we needed to then fold in. So that was a challenge.
And sounds like kind of at the last minute, right, to get
yeah. So we had to go back
and
to
it's amazing
yeah,
footage
very
and stills,
rich footage
yeah,
that nobody's seen before.
Because they had wonderful photographers there.
And they documented everything.
Yeah.
So it's very rich material, and a lot of it was well shot. And then there was other footage we came across, like Penny Baker, the great documentarian, he did a documentary called David about Synanon in the
Fantastic, yeah.
1970s. But you can't, nobody can get access to that film. It's hard to see these days. So anyway, we were able to fold in some footage from that. And also outside of the Synanon archive, there were people, as Mark say, who attended Synanon, who took photographs and filmed themselves. And there was also a lot of audio recordings. So we were able to fold all of that in, and I think, and we hope, we'll create an experience for audiences to really feel what it was like to be at Synanon.
And that, and I think that also what's exciting, and we were really happy to have like a big canvas of, these 4 one-hour episodes to tell the story in, is it sort of goes beyond what, you sort of referred to, Ryan, as like these cult series. Not in any particular series that I'm, thinking about, but if the experience, you really see the arc, of both the organization and the characters who are telling their story, and having that kind of context and understanding of how they were taken on this journey is sort of really fascinating. But they were great, and once they came on board, really wonderfully reflective and exciting, and their life experience and how they articulate that. They just were great subjects.
Yeah, and I mean, there are things that happened at Synanon. I mean, as we said, it started as this drug treatment program, very forward-thinking, progressive, and then, they started shaving heads, and then there were forced mastectomies and abortions, and, and then it kind of transferred down to the kids in ways that many of them felt like was quite abusive. And so I think in watching the series, like if you just hear that, you're like, how does that happen? But when you're watching it, you see how it went from A to B to C, and how they made sense of these changes, these outward changes, and kind of stayed on this journey despite situations that now they look back and say, I can't believe I did that.